Good evening and welcome. I'm John Godfrey. I'm chair of the University of Michigan's Wallenberg Committee, and it is my distinct honor to welcome back to the university Masha Gessen, who in 2015 received the Wallenberg Medal, and Misha Friedman, who in 2015 was a guest of the Penny Stamp Speaker Series. They join us tonight to talk about their just released book, Never Remember, Searching for Stalin's Gulags in Putin's Russia. In this work of extraordinary power, Masha and Misha weave together writing and photographs that haunt and disturb, that create a narrative geography of murder, that declaim an elegy and epitaph for the effaced, and that indict killers both in the past and of the past. Masha Gessen is among the most distinguished writers and journalists we are fortunate to have. She is fearless and fierce, an enterprising and independent writer and voice, and prolific beyond believing. Born in Moscow and a longtime resident of Russia, she lives in New York City and is a visiting professor at Amherst College. Masha adds luster to the masthead of The New Yorker, where she is a staff writer. Her work also appears in many other leading publications in the US and Europe, including the New York Review of Books, the New York Times, The Atlantic, Harper's Magazine, The Guardian, and The Economist. Her many books include the recent The Future is History, How Totalitarianism Reclaimed Russia, The Man Without a Face, The Unlikely Rise of Vladimir Putin, as well as The Brothers, The Road to an American Tragedy, which relates the story of the Tsarnaev brothers who were responsible for the Boston Marathon bombing. Misha Friedman is a courageous documentary photographer and storyteller whose exceptional and far-reaching photo essays include explorations of patriotism and corruption in Russia, the lives of internally displaced persons in Ukraine, the Russian annexation of Crimea, the impact of tuberculosis in Uzbekistan, Kenya, and Chechnya, and the private lives of LGBTQ people and homophobia in Russia. Misha is a native of Moldova who now lives in New York City with his family. He earned degrees in economics and political science and worked in finance, and then decided to seek his fortune in humanitarian aid work and photography. He worked with Doctors Without Borders and other non-governmental aid organizations in Uganda, Nigeria, Darfur, and India before turning to photography full-time. His work appears in The New Yorker, Der Spiegel, Le Monde, The New York Times, The New Republic, and The Los Angeles Times. Never Remember is his third book. This evening, Masha will speak first, and she will be followed by Misha, and then they will leave time for your questions following their presentations. Thank you. Masha?
Thank you. It's so good to be back here. So this book had a strange sort of beginning. Misha called me and said I was just at Michigan, and let's go find Wallenberg. I thought that any suggestion of doing a book together that came from Misha would be irresistible because we'd have a double byline. That was Masha and Misha, and like what publisher was going to say no to that? But we, this sort of flippant idea of going to Russia to find Wallenberg, which better people have tried to do, was actually a great and sort of symbolic beginning to this project. Because, and for me it was also very personal because my mother, as far as I know, was the first journalist to write in Russian about Wallenberg. And so we started actually this project by going to Moscow to try to document the invisibility of Wallenberg. Because really this whole book is about trying to capture the way that something is not seen. Right? And that, for a photographer, I think is much more difficult than for a writer. How do you photograph something that's invisible? But that's what we tried to do. And so we went to Moscow, and I remembered actually that there was a a monument to Wallenberg somewhere in Moscow. I couldn't remember where it was. And then I did a little bit of research, and I realized that it was in the courtyard of the Library of Foreign Literature, which was a place where I actually spent a lot of time as a child because my mother worked there. But it's this sort of out-of-the-way place. It's, I mean, it's in fairly central Moscow, but it stands on kind of an island, and it's separated from the street by a gate. It's this closed courtyard, so nobody wanders in by accident. And so we walked in, and it's the strangest thing I've ever seen, because it was this courtyard full of monuments. It's not exactly a warehouse, but it was a sort of a collection. It was all these monuments that had no place in Moscow, and they had all been warehoused in this courtyard. And you could tell by walking through this courtyard what Moscow, or Russia in general, didn't want to remember, what memory it couldn't accommodate. And central in this exposition of non-memories was a bust of Raoul Wallenberg, which still had a question mark next to it had the birth date and then dash question mark. It made me think of the sort of the particular indignity of the anonymous death and the dehumanizing effect of the anonymous death. And, obviously wasn't the first person to think about this. Hannah Arendt wrote about it very eloquently in The Origins of Totalitarianism, how the industrial anonymized death of the Nazi death camps was the ultimate dehumanizing thing. Because, death, if you think about it, is a physical occurrence. It always has a place, and it always has a date. And if there's nothing else you know about death, you know when and where it happened. And this is actually something that so many families in Russia have been deprived of knowing for so long. And that is such an important part of totalitarian terror. The taking away of the individuality, the physicality of death. And the next person that we talked to was someone that I had spent a lot of time when I was a reporter in Russia, talking to. It's a woman named Irina Fliege, who is now the head of the St. Petersburg chapter of the Memorial Society, which works on documenting and memorializing, among other things, primarily the crimes of Stalinism. And one of the things that we talked about that day was why when Memorial started working with death certificates, they discovered that death certificates that the families of people who had perished in Stalinist terror never contained an accurate cause of death, right? Or almost never. Sometimes it said, usually it said, pneumonia or heart attack. Sometimes it actually said cause of death, execution. They never contained an accurate place of death. Place was always kept secret. That very important physical aspect of death was kept secret. But it contained often an accurate time of death. And the reason that it contained an accurate time of death, and this was a revelation to me when I was speaking to Irina, was that the people who were reporting back to their superiors about having carried out the execution had to document the fact that they had done it in the middle of the night. Because having done it in the middle of the night demonstrated to their superiors that they had done it properly in secret. And actually that was a very interesting conversation also because to Fliege, that was very much a story about how even when they were doing it, they knew that what they were doing was not legitimate. The secrecy was necessary because they were doing something that shouldn't have been done, which actually I think is one of the distinctions between Stalinist terror and Nazi terror. But we talked about that, and we talked about, and this is a lot of this is in the book, about how Fliege and her then partner Benjamin Jöffe went about finding the first site of mass executions in Russia to have been identified, but which also happened to be the first site of a mass execution. It was an execution that took place in the last days of October and the early days of November of 1937. And I was particularly interested in that place because I was also particularly interested in documenting how memorialization has changed over the course of the last 20 years. And I had actually gone to the opening of the memorials at the site of the mass execution in early November 1997. And so we went back 20 years later to look at what had happened there. And I'm not going to give away what had happened there. It was not at all what I expected. But I started talking to Fliege about it, and I said, look, I want to write a book about forgetting. Because, you know, what we all thought was going to happen in the 90s was that there was going to be remembering. And the remembering started happening, and now it's been replaced by forgetting. And she said, you were completely wrong. That's not what's happening. And I was really taken aback because I thought we were like-minded people. I said, well, what do you mean, you know, it's not what's happening? And she said, well, in order to have forgetting, you have to have had remembering. In order to forget, you have to remember. And, you know, in order to remember, you also have to forget. She said, when we in the 90s thought that what was happening was remembering, we took so much for granted. And most of all, we took for granted this idea that there was a past and there was a present and they were distinct. Remembering can only happen when the past is past. But the past wasn't past. And what we mistook for remembering wasn't actually remembering. And what is happening now is not forgetting. It's just still not remembering. And so that's why the book is called Never Remember. Then, you know, after that conversation, the focus of the book sort of changed, and I started focusing on how the not remembering was happening. Because if in order to forget, you have to remember, and in order to remember, you have to forget, then what do you have to do in order to not remember? You have to live in this continuous present, or continuous past. You have to maintain a kind of state of confusion. You have to not allow sense-making to set in. And that understanding really allowed me to see, I think, much more clearly what we were observing. So among the 3 places that we went to for the book was Perm 36. And Perm 36 was a fascinating place in Russia. It was the last remaining Gulag camp. Now, Gulag camps weren't actually built to last. They weren't really places in the sort of traditional sense of the word, because a Gulag camp was a function, right? It was created where something had to be done. A mine had to be mined, or a construction project had to be carried out, and then it would disappear and rematerialize somewhere else, often under the same name, to perform a different task, or the same task in a different place. So it had a name that looked like a place name, but it wasn't actually a place, right? It was a function. So a lot of the time when you look at maps of the Gulag, and then we saw this when we were in Kolyma, you will see the same names sort of popping up all over the map, because these places aren't fixed on the map. And because this was a function, not a place, none of the camps were actually built to last, right? They were always makeshift structures. And if they were abandoned, they would just kind of disappear. A lot of the time, they're wooden structures. But in this one particular place, outside the city of Perm, in the Urals, there was a camp that when the Gulag ceased to exist after Stalin's death, a few years after Stalin's death, it was converted to a camp for the law enforcement officers who had been sentenced for abuse of power. And so it got a lot of upgrades, because of course you couldn't keep law enforcement officers, no matter how bad the crimes that they had committed were. You couldn't keep them in the same conditions as common criminals or politicals. So it got indoor plumbing and, not full indoor plumbing, but at least it got sinks and food basins in the barracks. And it even got like some sort of alley planted, and it was beautified. And for about 2 decades, it was a camp for these law enforcement officers, and then it was converted again to a camp for political prisoners under Brezhnev, and then his successors Andropov and Chernenko and Gorbachev. So. And this is when the population of political prisoners in the Soviet Union was relatively small. This was not sort of total state terror of the kind of the Stalinist kind. This was much more selective, right? So there were, at any given time, there were several hundred to several thousand political prisoners in the Soviet Union. These were what we traditionally think of as dissidents, and these were religious activists. And nationalist activists, right? So nationalist liberation, anti-imperialist activists. And a lot of them, there were only about three or four political prisoner camps at any given time. So a lot of these people ended up in Perm. And the ones who were repeat political offenders always ended up in Perm. So this was the harshest, most important political prisoner camp in the Soviet Union. In 1987, when the Soviet Union stopped jailing political prisoners, it abandoned the camp. And then fairly soon after that, sort of in architectural degradation terms, in 1992, some local historians came across the site and realized it and recognized it immediately. I mean, none of this was documented in any open way, right? But they recognized it immediately as an important site and as a place that preserved the memory of both political persecution and the Gulag, right? Because there was almost nothing left from the Gulag. So they undertook this very strange project of restoring this camp to its original condition. They propped up the buildings. They even recreated the wood workshop and the timber production, so they could sell timber but also restore the buildings. And they returned it to very much sort of the condition that it had been in before it stopped being a camp. And they also started holding an annual political and singer-songwriter festival there. And they also turned it into a museum of the camp and a museum of the Gulag. And so it was known as the only museum effort in Russia, in this entire vast space, that was actually located at the site of a Gulag camp, right? And that's actually something to ponder for a second, right? I mean, that whole country had been covered by a web of camps, and the only camp, there was only one that had been turned into a museum. And after the political crackdown began in Russia in 2012, that museum was taken over by the state. The people who had started it were kicked out, and new state employees were started remaking the museum. And what I had read about it before we went there was that it was turned into a museum that glorified the Gulag. Because that's, I mean, it's pretty far out of the way, and the people who had visited were sort of sending out those kinds of dispatches. And so that's what we went there prepared to see. But what we saw was much stranger and to me much more important in the end, which is that you couldn't make heads or tails of what was going on there. I mean, we walked into this one barrack where they had actually preserved the exhibition that had been there under the old regime. And the tour guide said, "We have had some outstanding people spend time here." And she pointed to the pictures of the dignitaries that had been imprisoned there. It was clearly a point of pride with her that they had graced this land with their presence. And then we went to another barracks where they had mounted an exhibit on the evolution of the inmate bed. And the exhibit showed that inmate sleeping conditions had improved from decade to decade through the evolution of the Gulag. And it wasn't an exhibit that glorified the Gulag, right? You weren't supposed to emerge from there thinking that the Gulag had been wonderful, or, you know, the dormitory conditions were terrific. It was just kind of senseless. And then there was also on the wall, they had put a quote, an actual real quote from Varlam Shalamov, who was an incredible writer who had spent, I think, 17 years in the Gulag and wrote a series of absolutely heart-wrenching short stories. Just a new translation just issued by the New York Review of Books publishing house. Really amazing stuff. Anyway, so Shalamov, there was a quote from Shalamov on the wall, and the quote was, "Man is blessed with his ability to forget." It's pretty much the last quote that I would ever put on the wall of a museum. It was completely ripped out of context. I went back to reread the story that it came from, and the story is actually about something entirely different. It's about sort of the dehumanizing influence of the camps, and how the only way to survive the camps and remain in any way human was to forget what had happened to you. But of course, put on the wall of this museum, it wasn't a command to forget. It wasn't, and it wasn't a command to, you know, think of the Gulag as something wonderful. It was just senseless. And the whole experience of being in that museum was cacophonous. You didn't come out of it thinking that you understood something or saw something. You came out of it confused. And I think ultimately that's the mechanism of not remembering. It's not the mechanism of forgetting. The mechanism of forgetting is, you know, overriding memories and throwing them out, or creating some other kind of profound narrative that replaces an earlier one. That would be forgetting. But what we were watching was not remembering, right? Not knowing, not being able to access an understanding, you know, not knowing what the death date was, not knowing under what circumstances somebody died, not knowing where it happened, not knowing what anything meant. And that's how you ensure that people don't remember what you don't want them to remember. And so I think of this book as just a tiny effort to make a little bit of sense, and a tiny effort to fix some images that can actually be clear. Helps that they're black and white. And to see things that are happening in real time and that have a beginning and a middle and an end. So it's a book of stories. There are a bunch of people in the book. who tell their stories. Some of their stories are about finding memories. Some of their stories are about what happened to them in the camps. Some of their stories are not terribly uplifting, but they're stories, and they make sense. And maybe it's a small step toward toward remembering, or at least a small step toward understanding how we go about not remembering. And I'll let Misha take it from there.
Well, how do I? So it's actually kind of it's our first time talking about it. The book literally came out. It's not even out. It's but we're here, and I saw the books. So what I want to do is show a few pictures and tell a few stories, and then maybe answer if someone has like technical questions or whatever questions that could come in the Q&A or later. I do want to say that as a photographer, like photography in general is a horrible, like, technical thing that's not, at least in theory, it's not well equipped to deal with subject of memory and past. Like, photography is amazing for showing consequences. Right? Stuff happened, this is what it looks like now, or what it will lead to, like climate change or breaking news. But how do you show the past? How do you show, and in a sense, I'm incredibly lucky to be working on this project with Masha, where the way we organized our work was, we were very clear that we are going to try to complement. I'm not going to try to illustrate what you're describing, but I'm going to try to get a sense of what we're trying to do and attempt at answering some of the questions that we will face. I think most of the time I failed. I've tried to succeed. I think I've managed to succeed a few times, and I'll go through a few examples that are in the book. And also, it's also my first time talking about this book, so I brought notes. I usually don't. So, you know, in Moscow, executioners are whitewashed, and terror is kind of normalized. Here you have the Russian University of Transport. You know, and they're advertising and they're trying to attract new students. By showing historical figures after whom the university was named over the years. So they have the last Tsar, Nicholas II. They have Dzerzhinsky, the founder of Cheka, effectively KGB, responsible for a lot of the terror, and Stalin. And all three, we're supposed to be equally proud of all three. And then they have all the social network things in the bottom right corner. Now we're in Magadan, and a lot of what I try to do is I look for things where people kind of normalize things that are not supposed to be normalized, or accepting the unacceptable. So here we have. On the left-hand side, we have a Gulag transit jail, and next to it you have residential housing with, it's a neighborhood in Magadan. You have vegetable gardens, and you have kind of a normal life built around it, and people have just accepted this abandoned building without demolishing it, without trying to get rid of it, as just, as normal. That's the Perm 36 restored Gulag camp that Masha had talked about. And on the day we were there in the late spring, and all the snow melted. So on top of all the barbed wire and and everything else, like the water really made it look like a fortress with a moat, like like a fortification, and it was quite a sight. So this is the harbor in Magadan where prisoners were arrived by ship, and that in the 30s that was the only way to reach Magadan, and this is what it looks like now. The abandoned structure in the foreground, the locals call this neighborhood Shanghai, and it's a kind of almost like a separate conversation lecture of I think it goes back to the Soviet idea that China is somehow backward and dilapidated, and so they would call these like structures just Shanghai, and so I'm in Shanghai. Given what China looks like now, and when I was there was a tide, and so you have kids playing, collecting like shells. These are overgrown remains of a uranium mine, uranium factory actually. Apologize. Prisoners who worked there, they did not wear any protective gear. It was totally non-existent, and radiation is still quite high in there. I mean, we were there with a guide who kind of told us what to do and what not to do, like don't drink water, things like that, and don't spend too much time here. So this is Sandarmokh in Karelia. It's a mass execution site, and people it's a place where thousands of people were killed and dumped into mass graves. And over the years, since the site was discovered in the mid-90s, relatives have come to try to personalize the site by putting pictures like that one on trees. Same region. This is just a few miles down the road from the site. This is a house of culture. So this is a typical bust of Lenin that, there were probably millions of them in Soviet Union that was thrown out, in the early 90s. And the people who worked there, they found it and decided to bring it back. Like, why? You never know. So they just kind of storing it in the back behind some benches, like why, yeah. Yeah, I wish it was funny. And I kind of wanted to end this with the picture that's on the cover. And Inna, she was our guide. And she was she was a geologist and a political activist, kind of a Democrat who, was a member of a kind of Yabloko Democratic Party in Russia, she was one of the people who found the uranium mines in the region. And then she led a huge effort to help bury some of the remains of prisoners. And then she started the museum, but over the years, she began to change her kind of opinions, and she began to change her mind. And some of the things that she told us, that she's tired of being a minority. Like, she's tired of being by herself, that she actually likes Putin now, that she wants to be with winners. And she also thought that the number of prisoners that everyone has reported, both killed and that were in the Gulag, were probably exaggerated. And ultimately, most of Gulag was necessary to prepare the country for World War II. And I want to end my little presentation about a positive something positive thing to say about Russia, but it's hard. You know, like, and so I kind of would love to move to the Q&A, and all the pictures, all the pictures in the book have stories like this one. So these are just 8, and thank you for being here with us.
We'll take questions now.
Oh, and there's a microphone. Please wait for the microphone so we can.
This is in Magadan. This is in the Russian Far East.
Yeah. Let me just, I'll tell the story of that particular neighborhood. So this is, Kolyma was the kind of the ultimate harshest camps in the Gulag system. It's the far, far east. Many people died en route to those camps. They would delivered there by sea, and then they would also have to walk hundreds of miles to the actual camps. They mined uranium, gold, and nickel, I think there.
And platinum. Maybe that came later. But
Right.
Yeah. Ore.
Right. In 1956, when they released most of the inmates, a lot of the inmates just stayed. Some of them didn't have the money to go home. Some of them had no home to go back home to. A few tried to go home and couldn't make it work and came back to this harsh Far East. A lot of the inmates in this particular camp had been Ukrainians who had been accused of being Nazi collaborators. So they had been sent to Kolyma. And what was a Nazi collaborator? Some people obviously were Nazi collaborators, but basically, as everything with the Gulag, it was random and bureaucratic. So if you were on occupied territory, then you could be condemned as a collaborator. And when I was first there in 1998, I met some of the people who had lived there their entire lives. There was this one woman who had been 17 years old at the end of the war when she was exiled to this camp. Then she was released 11 years later, and she came to this place, and this was this little, it was kind of a squatting village on the outskirts of this little geologist town. They just started building there. They had no plumbing, they had no city services, but also nobody was chasing them off. So they built these little houses. And then when inmates were released, they would go and stay with other former inmates from Ukraine who had built this little town, or this little part of town. And so I went and I met this woman who had lived there her entire life. She had met her husband in that very house where she came and was given a cot when she was released, and then this other guy was also given a cot there. They were both from Ukraine. They got married. They lived there their entire lives. Then he died. She was still living in this house. And I tried to get her to talk to me about how she felt about having had her life stolen by the Soviet regime. And she kind of shrugged and she said, well, the country needed us. She'd worked for her country in the camps. And so when we came back, I asked if anybody was left in these houses. And Ina, our guide, said, no, there's nobody left there. And in fact, there's nothing left, because that little part of town was flooded. And so she took us for a walk there, and that's what's in this picture. That's the remains of this sort of squatter village. And we walked through, and Misha photographed her, and then she sort of turned around and she said, are you going to make us look bad?
Yeah.
Are you going to make it look like the whole town is just dilapidated and awful? It was such a horrible moment because she was like sort of addressing us with this patriotic fervor, but to her, it was the destruction caused by the flood and the dilapidation of this village that was important. And we were documenting a whole other story, and so that picture ended up on the cover of the book, which I'm sure she's not going to be terribly happy about.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's after we spent a couple of days together already. and during which she said nothing. She was okay taking us to the mines and talking about everything else, and I must have clicked the shutter twice. And she kind of instinctively, I felt that was the moment, and she was, I don't know, like 15 feet away, and she felt that was also like critical. Yeah.
Thank you both. Oh, that's loud. Thank you both so much for being here. In both of your respective works, it is unflinching and very honest, and so thank you so much for sharing. I am struck by your example about the museum, in part because in Karaganda in Kazakhstan, there is a Karlog museum, which is a little more about storytelling and a little more about capturing the experience of the people who have lived through these atrocities. I'm curious from your perspective, what would it take to have an honest view, and how can we, as people who are living in this generation, capitalize on living at the same time for the last generation of people who have suffered under Stalinism?
Thank you. That's a great question. That's the question. So I think there's a significant difference between what's possible in Karaganda or in Riga or in Prague and what's possible in Moscow or Perm or St. Petersburg. And what I mean by that is not that the regime in Kazakhstan is so much better than the regime in Russia. That's actually not the case, right? But there's something that has to do with storytelling, right? When the Soviet Empire dissolved, pretty much every post-Soviet country that wasn't Russia had the option, and many of them took the option, of othering the terror, right? Of saying, they did this to us. We're occupied. It was Moscow. It was, it was, the story sort of works most effectively in the Baltics, where it's this very coherent narrative. We were good. Then the Soviets came, then the Nazis came, then the Soviets came again. It was all occupation. Everything that happened because of them. And now we can go back to being good again. And that's actually, and I'm not making light of that story. That's a hugely important story. It's a story that creates trust and the possibility of trust in society, and the possibility of sort of moving forward. The task that Russia faces, the task of saying, we did this to ourselves, I don't know if it's possible. I don't know of a country that has done that has said, we did this to ourselves. And not only that, but we can't actually tell the victims from the perpetrators. We can, but we can't, right? Because the victims were perpetrators and the perpetrators were victims, which is not to say that they're all morally the same, not at all, right? But that, what do you do with an executioner who was then executed on false charges of spying for 14 different countries? What do you do with a woman, and this is actually in my other current book, The Future's History, what do you do with a woman who gives up her husband as a Trotskyist, which he was, and then lives bereft for the rest of her life for 50 years because she has had the love of her life executed in the name of the party? Is she a victim or is she a perpetrator? She's both. And that's sort of like the quintessence of having done this to ourselves. So I don't know what it will take. I don't actually know if it's possible.
I was thinking about those three pictures at the very beginning of the Tsar and particularly of Stalin. And I think I read in the paper that Stalin has suddenly become Mr. Popular again. And I was wondering what the basis of that is. And yet I think that I got some of the answer to that question from hearing about this woman and hearing the way they're flipping around the narrative about what really happened. But in any case, why Stalin? Stalin? Why?
Okay. So Stalin, that's actually not new news. It's suddenly gotten traction, but Stalin has come out on top in the biannual poll of who's the greatest man, who's the greatest person of all time and place. And Russians have named Stalin consistently for, I think, the last 8 years. Currently, Putin is in second place, which he splits with Pushkin. And I can't remember, I think it's Peter the Great who's in third place. But, oh no, she's not even a man. But,
Gagarin is Peter the Great and Gagarin.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So, there's a sort of the concept of greatness is really basic and really aggressive and kind of mean. It's like making a mark on the world, an indelible mark. Right? And so even when you see sort of a blip that's not Russian, it will be someone like Napoleon or Hitler. Right? They made a mark. Right? But that's kind of, I mean, that reveals, I think, the values of that society.
I have 2 sentences and 1 question. Sentence number 1. Next week on Sunday, there will be a presidential election in Russia, and nobody knows who will win. It's a secret. It's a secret. Sentence 2. You are taking pictures today about something that happened in past. And now the question, is Putin's Russia different from Stalin's Russia? Thank you.
So, I had this really interesting experience last night. I actually had a little party at my house for a journalist friend from Moscow who's just gotten a prize, and so we had this Russian get-together in Harlem. And we were talking about the presidential election, and it was the oddest experience because we would talk, and the only way you can discuss it, I mean, we're discussing like the people who are running for office and voting, and we kept using these words like they meant something. And the conversation would build and build and build, and at a certain point, everyone would burst out laughing. Because nothing of what we said actually meant what it could mean, or anything else, right? I mean, the whole sort of exercise was devoid of meaning, but we still wanted to talk about the presidential election, and so we would resume the conversation, then would like build and build, and then would burst out laughing again, because again, it was this bubble, right? It's the weirdest thing because you can't actually sort of talk about it in a meaningful way, but you also can't talk about it in any other way. It's this exercise in taking every word and even act, like, the act of voting that people can perform, and hollowing it out. And then saying, okay, well, what are you going to do with this hollowed out reality? So that's just a statement in response to your statement. But yeah, Putin's Russia is different from Stalin's Russia, of course. And I think that one really important difference, and it really is an important difference, is that Stalin's Russia, and this is more sort of the topic of my big book of text, which is the Future's History. Stalin's Russia was at a point of establishing a totalitarian regime, right? So it was sort of the classic Arendtian paradigm of having ideology and terror at work to establish and exercise control over the population. Putin's Russia is completely different. It doesn't need total terror, right? Because Stalin's Russia did that already. It established that violence is always possible. It's always just a hair's breadth away. And so in Putin's Russia, like in the later decades of the Soviet Union, there's a kind of economy of terror. People don't get swept up in the middle of the night. Most people don't get swept up in the middle of the night. You really only need to sweep up one or two to keep the whole population under control. So it's a different place, but it can only exist because Stalin's Russia existed. That's what we're here for.
My question is for Misha, and it's actually a little bit more of a technical question, if you don't mind. I noticed the photographs that you showed tonight are in black and white, And I'm wondering if that's something that you usually do in your photography, or if you chose it specifically for this project, and if so, why?
I chose it specifically for this project. Most kind of straight editorial journalism that I do is usually in color. It's like, I'm showing consequences. Here the topic is much more complicated, and color, for many reasons, is an unnecessary distraction. Plus, I was also working with archives, because there are all these panoramas, but as, for example, when we visited the Memorial Society, I was photographing black and white, rephotographing black and white mugshots. So you don't want color there. And those things have to kind of, yeah.
You mentioned early on about the Gulag Museum and how the sort of state caretakers of that museum seem to present a fairly confusing view of what they wanted to convey. How does the current administration like to portray the gulags to the larger society? And did you get the feeling that the caretakers of the museum were given a specific direction as to how to portray things, or that they just didn't sort of know how they were supposed to portray them?
Thanks. No, I don't think they were given specific directions. I think they have a sense of what they're supposed to show. And that sense is, on the one hand, of course, it's this cacophonous sort of reality. On the other hand, this single central myth of Russian history in Putin's Russia is World War II. And in the victory in World War II, there's a wonderful sociologist named Lev Gutkov who explains that World War II is the perfect historical myth because it shines its light both forwards and backwards. So forwards, it explains how the Soviet Union became a superpower. And it bolsters Russia's claim to being a superpower, right? So, I mean, Russia's current grievance is that it's not, it doesn't get to play a big enough role in the contemporary world, that the world has become unipolar, but really there should be two superpowers, right? The United States and Russia. But it also shines its light backwards by justifying all the terror that preceded and accompanied World War II, because if the Soviet Union was victorious in World War II, and if the Soviet Union scored a military victory over Hitler, then the Soviet Union was good, and everything that had happened in the Soviet Union was part of that goodness. So the default position, deriving from that, is that the Gulag existed to prepare the country for World War II. There's not a word of truth or historical reality to that interpretation, but it works for the myth. And so that's, that's sort of the basic narrative.
Hi, Masha and Misha.
We love that.
It's a question not related to the gulags. Is it cool to ask that? So, I was wondering, you write and talk a lot about how in Russia, because of its history and the way it kind of like still is now, that there's this sort of national acceptance of and like belief in corruption, not just within Russia, but like in other institutions in countries all over the world. And you also kind of have a justifiably like pessimistic outlook on a lot of other institutions outside of Russia. And you've written before about, I think you called them like glasses that you can see other things in. But I'm wondering if it's also something that you feel like sometimes you might be influenced by Russia in ways that you need to have checks to control for, and if so, what those controls might be. Thanks.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, the answer is I don't know, right? I suspect I am. I mean, we are all shaped by our experiences, and that's what intuition is. It's sort of a compilation of experience. So my intuition is very much shaped by having lived in Russia. I think it's a little, maybe a little bit more finely tuned than some other people's, just because I've shuttled back and forth between these two countries. And I'm always precarious and always in doubt. So my saying, I don't know, is actually like my strategy. I generally assume I don't know. And I try to always assume that there's a whole lot of uncertainty to what I'm thinking and writing about. And so I turn it in my head as much as possible before I can land on some one thing that seems certain at the moment, but I also know how precarious it is. I don't know if that's always an effective strategy, but that's sort of how I try to turn it in my head.
Hi. It's getting off the subject a teeny bit, but I was wondering if you could comment on maybe an inside scoop on the bromance between Putin and Trump that you could reveal to us tonight. Tell all, please.
Yes. Everything I know, I learned in Masha columns. So. Yeah.
Yes. So I have a question over here. This presentation is wonderful, but it also reminds me of a Michael Palin PBS show. He was the Monty Python guy, and he had a series called, what the subtext was, he goes there so you don't have to. And he went to Vladivostok, among other places.
Yeah.
But and I share your pessimism that this is something that's just going to go on for a long time. But here's another possible take. The Tsar and Stalin and those folks in that era depended upon some things that they could count on. The Tsar had the Russian Orthodox Church that would support Orthodox monarchy. They had the peasantry. They had the remoteness of Russia, which is somewhat less than globalization. They had a fear of foreign invasion, which is much dissipated now since countries don't invade so much anymore. Nowadays, Putin's still around running a similar thugocracy or whatever you want to call it, but it no longer has a lot of those things that propped it up. So I'm wondering if we have some hope, at least, that instead of, like you were saying, which I tend to mostly agree with, that there's a kind of continuity here and it's likely to keep going on because that's the way Russia's always been. Is there some hope that what's clicking now is that Putin keeps it going because he's so energetic and persuasive, and if he gets old and tired, or there's nobody else to replace him who's so clever on television and with children and whatnot on videos, that eventually, pretty soon, people will realize it's sort of like the Wizard of Oz, and the game is up, the curtain comes back, and it's seen as a fraud, and things move to a better setting.
Yeah. So I'm not in the business of predictions, but I want to take issue with a couple of things that you said. That first of all, Putin is not energetic and persuasive. I take it you don't speak Russian.
But I've heard him speak English, and he was pretty good.
Yeah, well, trust me. Not a description that fits. And I think, but more important, I think that you've actually sort of, in your very good reasoning, you did something that people often do, which is they mistake their excellent understanding of reality for a shared understanding of reality. Just because countries don't invade so much anymore doesn't mean that Russia is any less afraid of foreign invasion than it was 100 years ago. If you talk to Russians, they will tell you that Russia is constantly waging defensive war against all the potential foreign invaders. And by all the potential foreign invaders, they mean America, which is why Russia is fighting proxy wars against the United States in Ukraine and Syria. Now, you wouldn't know that necessarily living in this country, but Russians are convinced of this. And a lot of Russians are actually convinced of that there are Americans fighting in Ukraine. So is it terribly likely that they're going to be disabused of this notion because Putin is no longer around? Yes and no, actually. I mean, I don't think it's going to be this sort of sudden coming to fact-based reality. But I do think that anything can happen after Putin goes, and as far as I know, he's probably not immortal. So, but he thinks he is. But this is the point where I always recommend reading Josh Rubinstein's book Last Days of Stalin, which is a great, great book about last days of Stalin, and it shows just how chaotic the transition was, and how anything was possible, and how it was a total free-for-all, and how the U.S. foreign policy establishment was asleep at the wheel, because they were convinced of a couple of fallacies. One was that there was a danger that after Stalin died, the hardliners might come to power. And I think you hear that a lot about Putin these days. So just remember when they used to say that after Stalin died, the hardliners might come to power. And then there was that they were convinced that there was Stalinism, and that that Stalin's figure was not that important to it. And again, that's something that we hear a lot now. And I think it's probably just as wrong now as it was then, right? There's a cult of personality in Russia, and everything is built to revolve around Putin, both sort of symbolically and imaginatively, but also just in the way that Russia functions as a mafia clan, where he holds all the power and all the money and distributes it. And so when he goes, that system collapses. You can just like plug another person into that place. So at that point, anything can happen, maybe even good things.
Thank you. So I actually just got done reading The Future is History.
Oh, wow.
And this question tries to connect that with what's going on tonight. So, and to all who haven't read it, I mean, this book that really deserves the hype given tonight. And if you haven't read it, it's about many different people coming of age in Russia. And this question is in regards to that. So how do you see any generational divide play out in remembering the past, even if there is a generational divide in Russia?
Right. Thank you for that question. So, as you know, having read the book, that book is very much about sort of the hope for a generational divide, and the hope that a new generation will bring a new reality, and the failure of that hope. And the fact that sort of the trauma of Stalinism was so severe that it is passed on from generation to generation and continues to shape society, even though people living today no longer have a living memory of terror. So I don't, in terms of memory, I think that there's less and less actual memory, there's less and less actual information that's passed on, partly because people are dying, or almost all the people who've been to the gulags have died, partly because people were, even after the Soviet Union collapsed, afraid to speak. There are a couple of stories like that in the book about people who were afraid to talk, who never believed for a second that it was now safe to open their mouths about what had happened. But I think even more important is just this, the experiment in state terror, which is at this point the longest running experiment in state terror that we're aware of, produced a kind of society that is best suited for surviving in conditions of state terror. And it's a society without memory, with only a kind of physiological memory and great big instincts for catching signals so as to improve their chances of survival, because that's what you have to do in a totalitarian society. In a society ruled by terror, you have to be incredibly sensitive, and you always have to try to be just a little bit ahead of the game, because failing to do so is mortally dangerous. That's the exact opposite of the sort of conditions that you need for remembering.
If I may add, I think I've thought of something positive to say.
Say it now.
In like, reporting on kind of older people, younger people, the one thing that stands out in Russia today is how essentially people like those who are under 25, they don't watch TV. Like they don't, they view Putin, Kremlin, everything that's related to that generation of, that mafia state. That just like very little is targeted at them. They just do not intersect. It just completely goes over them. All the slick propaganda that you have on kind of, Russian channels for 18 years, and it's getting better and better, or it keeps going steady. So my hope is with them is that when there are changes, because no one is immortal, that there are people who just, like I'm 41 and, this was before my times, but I feel like I'm looking at, like when I see like people in their 20s now, I'm thinking like this is probably what the late 70s and maybe early 80s in Russia was. Yeah, it sucked on many levels, but that's maybe how they looked at Brezhnev. Maybe that's how they looked at these octogenarians in Politburo. Whatever's happening there has nothing to do with us. So maybe there is hope that if changes happen soon enough, that these people are just somehow, they're not affected by or affected less because they do live online, because they travel, they like things, they do have a sense of fairness. And that sense is important. So, I don't see a lot of hope reporting on older people who do watch a lot of TV, but I do have hope there. Not because they're necessarily active or they're active in these huge numbers, but because they're just kind of, like Kremlin doesn't really know they doesn't really offer much to them anymore. Maybe.
Masha, I have a question over here. So I don't want to put you on the spot, but because you seem to have such a grasp of memory and you've been in America for a while, what your take on the American memory might be?
That's a great question. Well, we have a problem with memory in this country. It's one of the things that certainly, coming from a part of the world where for all the problems with memory is a problematized topic. Like, at least we know what we're not doing. Part of what strikes me in the U.S., every time sort of a conversation about the Confederate monuments flares up, is how much we don't know what we're not doing, right? How much there really isn't an ongoing conversation about historical memory. I think most people in this country wouldn't even know what to do with that term, right? Historical memory, and I find that when I talk to students about concepts of historical memory, their understanding really lags behind sort of what the mainstream of any kind of European conversation about historical memory, right? Where they're so much farther ahead of their peers on so many other topics, and so their understanding of a lot of political issues, but not historical memory. It's like we haven't even started having the conversation yet.
I want to thank Masha and Misha and invite you all to a reception out here. And I also want to thank the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies and the Wallenberg Committee for supporting this extraordinary book, but supporting these extraordinary photographers and writers who've been here tonight with us. So thank you very much. And let's continue the conversation.